Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are having a wonderful week, have your weekend loads booked, and are ready for Saturday and Sunday, which means fewer check calls from brokers. Anyway, it's Friday, so it's time for another weekly market update and forecast. Now, if you're new to this channel, welcome. I teach about the trucking industry with a heavy focus on the spot market as well as freight market analysis. So if this is a topic that interests you, feel free to subscribe down below. Anyway, guys, we are coming out of the Memorial Day weekend, so the data is going to be a little bit different. It's going to look a little bit different, but nevertheless, it should help you make decisions of where you should stay next week. Ready? Let's go. Now, before we actually go to the board, just a quick reminder, I am doing a live Q&A this Sunday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. So if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Anyway, let's go to the board. So as always, all of these charts will be attached down below so you guys can see them better. We are starting with the outbound tender volumes versus outbound tender rejections. And this is from the beginning of May. Blue is the outbound tender volumes, which shows us how much freight volume there is in the market. White, the white line, is the outbound tender rejections. Now, outbound tender rejections show us how much of the contract freight is actually getting rejected and therefore getting pushed to the spot market. As a reminder, the higher the tender rejection index, the better for spot carriers, because the more volume gets pushed to the spot market, the more of that volume soaks up spot market capacity, therefore increasing spot market rates. All right, let's take a look. So from the beginning of May, the first thing we can see is that volumes, they have climbed up a little bit. And then, of course, they had a big drop from the 28th to the 29th. Memorial Day, right? Memorial Day weekend. This is normal, which we will see in just a minute. And now, of course, the volumes are making a recovery after Memorial Day weekend. Now, let's take a look at the outbound tender rejection index. We can see that it kind of plummeted down towards the 11th to 14th of May. Since then, it's skyrocketed and reached up to 3.3%, which means that 3.3% of contract loads were ending up on the spot market. This is something that we haven't seen in a while. But then, of course, they dropped down together with the volumes. And now they're trending downward. Why is this happening? Because before Memorial Day weekend, a ton of capacity leaves the market. Lots of carriers don't work during that time. So, of course, if carriers are not working, rejection rates go up. So now let's take a look at volumes by looking at this chart, which shows us volumes from 2018 all the way to 2022. Now, I know this chart is harder to see, but this blue line right here, this is us right now. This is where we are. The yellow line is 2018. This pink line, which you can barely see right here, it's purplish pink, that is 2019 levels. Then we have the 2020 in orange, we have 2021 in green, and 2022 is this line right here. So I want to focus right here, right now, right? 2018 in yellow and 2019 in purple. As you can see, every single year there is a drop of volume around this time of year. This is because of Memorial Day weekend, right? Nothing is getting shipped out or less loads get shipped out. So that's normal. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, first of all, to show you that the drop in volumes is normal during this time of year. But number two is to look at patterns, right? Okay, let's zoom out a little bit. What we can see from previous patterns is after a drop from Memorial Day, usually the volumes come out higher in the beginning of June. And this is true of every single year, no matter which year you look at. Then the volumes slightly go down and they stay elevated relatively to before Memorial Day, until they drop again on the 4th of July, which is normal. Then the volumes start decreasing, and then they will experience an increase in November, towards the end of November, Thanksgiving. This is something that affects reefers especially. And of course, at the end of the year, there will be a spike in volume. But this is to just show you that usually we could expect higher volumes coming out of Memorial Day, a few days after Memorial Day. Now, there is a difference this year. This year, produce season is delayed. It's delayed because of the California rains. So unfortunately, we might not see a big spike here until later on. Okay, now let's look at the same chart, but for tender rejections. Now this chart, we are the blue line at the bottom. That's us right now. Basically, we're performing in terms of tender rejections worse than in the past 5 years. It's horrific. It's horrible. But something that we do see historically is the patterns. And again, this chart will be downloadable, so you will be able to see which line means what. But for you guys to know, the orange line is from 2019 to 2020, and the yellow one is from 2018 to 2019. So there are a few things that we have to pay attention to. Number one, we have to pay attention to the fact that somewhere in September, towards the end of September, there is always a spike in tender rejections. Then we can see that somewhere in November, there starts to be a climb in tender rejections. There is a spike, and this is because of the holidays and product has to be moved. And of course, towards the end of the year, each year, there is a spike in tender rejections driving rates up. Again, capacity starts leaving the market because it's the holidays. Tender rejections go up. So this is a pattern that you have to keep in mind. Okay, now on to the NTIL, which is the National Truckload Index for line haul only. This data is based on dry van operations. It shows us the average spot rates minus fuel surcharge. So fuel surcharge does not exist in this data. Currently, we can see we're at $1.63. Now, this is a good climb, and it continued climbing through Memorial Day weekend all the way until the 31st of May. Now it flatlined a little bit, but this is a better sign because before this, as you can see, towards the 12th, 13th of May, we were at like $1.49 per mile. And before that, we were stuck for a long time at $1.52 per mile. So this climb is welcome. Finally, of course, we have to look at the spot to contract rate spread. As you remember last week, I believe it was a 91-cent spread, which means that contract rates paid on average 91 cents more than the spot market. Currently, the spread is now 85 cents, which means that that spread got smaller. Part of the reason is because contract rates are dropping. Why are they dropping? Because the highest contract rates were actually in May of 2022. And those contracts are now coming to an end and being renegotiated at the current. So contract rates are continuing to fall. We need this spread to get smaller. Now let's take a look at diesel prices, which we usually look at the end of the video. But you know what? Yeah, let's look at it in the beginning. So diesel prices continue to go down. They're currently going up a little bit, but currently we are at $4.02 per gallon, which is good. It's welcome because at least it's going down. If we look at this map right here, we see that for the most part, it is red, which means pretty much everywhere diesel prices dropped, with the exception of Missoula, Montana. That's where diesel prices increased by a significant amount. Now, they also did increase in North Dakota. There was no change in Illinois, but yeah, significant amount was Missoula, Montana, the only significant increase here, which is good. All right, now it's time to look at more specific data, starting with flatbeds. As a reminder, I get these charts from Truckstop, and they show us basically what is the volume versus capacity like. So here on the left side, I know it has all the equipment types. We're focusing only on flatbeds here and here. So on this side, we have the number of loads picking up. What is the outbound volume? Here we have the number of loads dropping off. What is the volume of inbound trucks? What we need is for the outbound volume of loads to be higher than the amount of trucks going into that state. The only two states that have that in Midwest are Iowa and Illinois at the moment. In the Plain states, it's only Oklahoma. Western states, Idaho, Oregon, Washington. Northeast, Delaware, Maryland. And of course, the southern states are the winners because they usually have the most volumes compared to trucks. Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia. Now, from my personal experience with flatbeds over the past few months, I know that I personally strive to stay in the South. We don't really go to the Midwest unless absolutely necessary. I don't like the Midwest for flatbeds, although some people swear by it. So let's take a look at the heat map. So the heat map shows us the same exact data, but by market area. The darker it is, it means that there are more loads than trucks. So this is a good place to be where you'll have negotiating power. As you can see, the South is where it's the darkest, although there are certain areas. I was surprised about the Arizona area. Arizona is not a good place to be if you have a flatbed, from what I know. Southern California, there is Oregon right here, maybe, I can't even tell, is that Washington? I don't know, but basically West Coast. But in the West Coast, the best rates will be from West Coast to West Coast. Getting out of there is really difficult. To give you an idea, we had to get out of Southern California 2 days ago. The rate was terrible, and I'm going to share it with you next week on Monday or Tuesday. Don't judge me, it was California. But yeah, definitely the South is the place to be. Also some of the Midwest, I guess, but South is where I personally prefer to keep my flatbeds. Now let's take a look at reefers. Okay, first we're starting with reefer volumes. As a reminder, this map shows us the weekly change in volume as well as general volume. So the color on the map shows us the weekly change. If it's red, that means that volumes decreased in that market for reefers since last week. Blue means an increase. Gray or white is no significant change. The height of a market area shows us the general volume in that place at the moment. So what can we see? We can see that for reefers, there was no volume increase in California. There was no volume increase in Nogales, Arizona, which is usually where the produce comes in from Mexico. There was no increase in the Laredo, Texas area. There was no increase in Florida. Basically, produce not happening this week. We can see some increases in Oklahoma, Arkansas. There are significant increases in volumes in Georgia, maybe South Carolina, portion of Tennessee. In general, it is flat. It's just an increase from last week. But yeah, if we look at the big picture, there was no significant change with volumes. Unfortunately, there was a change with the Pendleton, Oregon market where volumes did drop. The reefer map is pretty boring. So let's take a look at tender rejections. By the way, someone asked me if I use a teleprompter to make these videos. I wish. Is there such a thing for like private use? Because that would make it so much easier. No, my process is actually writing out all the information, doing research in written form, then reading through it a couple of times, and then presenting it. So anyway, back to reefer rejections. Same principle. Blue means an increase in rejections for reefers from last week. Red means a decrease. And the height of a market area shows us total rejections in that market. So we can see that for the most part, this map is blue, which means that rejections did increase over the last week, which is not surprising. Capacity does decrease towards the end of the week, coming into Memorial Day weekend, so that's not a surprise. But we can see that rejections increased in Arizona, California, Portland, Oregon area, it looks like. Utah, Colorado, there were increases in the Midwest as well, but there were significant decreases in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and the Jacksonville area. So yeah, in general, it looks like in the Midwest, some of the West Coast, some of the Northeast even, rates did increase. Texas stayed flat. There was no change. But yeah, some rates did increase there. So let's take a look at the head haul index for reefers. I feel like I'm talking really fast. Maybe it's because I had too much coffee this morning, like a crazy amount of coffee. Yeah, ignore me. I'm trying to slow down here. I am sorry. Anyway, head haul index for reefers. A blue market area means that there are more loads going out of that market than there are trucks going into that market. A red market area signals overcapacity. There are too many trucks for the amount of loads in that market. For reefers, we can see in Texas, Central California, some places in the Midwest. It's interesting. It looks like the Orlando, Florida area, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, there is room for negotiation because there are more loads than trucks. Honestly, there is not much to say here. Reefers, there is not such a dire situation with overcapacity as with dry vans, as we will see in a few minutes. But yeah, it looks like in terms of negotiating power, it would be California, some Midwestern states, portion of Texas. Florida doesn't really count because you can see it's surrounded by overcapacity. So whoever is here is going to deadhead over here. So it doesn't count. Same thing happens with the Midwest, right? Like under capacity in Illinois, well, it doesn't really matter because there's overcapacity in Indiana and surrounding it. So people from here are going to be picking up loads from Illinois. Yeah, doesn't really work. Not a great situation, but not as bad as for dry vans. Let's take a look at where you have to go if you have a reefer. So this map, as a reminder, shows us volumes versus rejections. What we want to see is a market area that is as bright blue as possible, because that means that there are really high tender rejections, so higher spot rates or spot volumes and therefore rates. And height shows us general volume. The more volume, the more loads to choose from. We want to pair the two so that that high volume gets rejected and pushed to the spot market. So what can we see for reefers? Well, as it is every week pretty much for the past few weeks, Pendleton, Oregon, and Idaho. Idaho is new, but Pendleton, Oregon is a good place to be. There are a decent amount of tender rejections and a decent, it's not too big, but there's a decent amount of volume. Southern California looks like it's coming alive. Good amount of volume and good amount of tender rejections. I like Fort Worth, Texas, a ton of volume, nice amount of tender rejections. Iowa is interesting. It does have a little bit of volume, but there are a ton of tender rejections. But a place like South Dakota, well, the volume is just not there. Yes, the tender rejections are high, but the volume is not there. Same thing goes for Arkansas, Mississippi. What is this area? Basically this market right here. What is it? Oh, it's the Memphis, Tennessee market. I had to check my map. The Memphis, Tennessee market looks interesting. There are a ton of tender rejections, but the volume is just not there relatively. Also, same thing goes for the Southeast. We can see that the tender rejections are there, but look at that volume. It's completely flat. There is going to be nothing to choose from. So if I were a reefer operator, I would stay Southern California, Pendleton, Oregon, and run to Texas and back if possible, sometimes hitting the Midwest. But whatever you do, don't go to the Northeast. As you can see, it is gray. It is not a good place to be for reefers at the moment. Okay, time for dry vans, and we're starting with the volume map. As a reminder, the height of an area shows us the general volume in that area. The color shows us the volume change from last week. If the color is red, that means volumes dropped from last week. If it's blue, volumes increased. What can we see? Well, we can see it's a good spread between blue and red. For the most part, the West Coast looks unchanged, although California volumes dropped and Arizona volumes did increase a little bit. We can see that this portion, for the most part, not a good place to be, volumes dropped. We can see that in the Laredo, Texas market, volumes increased, Michigan, New York, and then random places, random market areas throughout the Midwest, South, and maybe a little bit of the Northeast as well. Colorful map, pretty to look at, doesn't give the best news. So let's take a look at tender rejections. Well, with tender rejections, it's a little bit different than for reefers. Reefers were mostly blue. Here we have red and blue. So we can see that in the West Coast, it looks like the Northern California and Oregon areas did have an increase in tender rejections. Some of Texas, right here, Louisiana. We can see a good increase in Illinois, some in Ohio, some in Southern Florida. For the most part, it's gray and red, I would say, which means no change or a decrease in tender rejections. Yeah, dry vans are definitely taking the worst beating of them all. So let's take a look at capacity, or the head haul index, to figure out what's going on. And we can see at least the western part of the US continues to have overcapacity, except for a little sliver right here in California, maybe some of Southern California and the Reno, Nevada area, but in general, West Coast is not the place to be for dry vans. It looks like Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, some southeastern states, these are places where there are more loads than trucks. So there is more negotiating power. Fort Worth, Texas looks interesting. Pennsylvania is interesting, but it's surrounded by overcapacity. So people are just going to be deadheading and grabbing all those loads, creating overcapacity here. Yeah, for dry van in general, overcapacity is a really big issue. And part of the reason is because dry vans are pretty cheap to operate. There's not much you have to do. They're cheaper than flatbeds because with flatbeds, you have to get all of the equipment to secure the load. With dry vans, it's just cheaper to operate. So many people go to dry vans first. So overcapacity galore. So where do you have to be if you have a dry van? Well, where you do not have to be is in the Northwest, right? In the Pacific Northwest. Horrible place. So here we see volumes, which is the height of an area, versus tender rejections, which is how blue the area is. Currently, we can see that Texas is very interesting, especially the Fort Worth and Houston areas. We can see there is volume there, and it's blue. Tender rejections are happening. It's an interesting place. Southern California is getting interesting. What I mean to say is more interesting. We're speaking English after all. Then we have a place like Wisconsin. Louisville, Kentucky is still interesting. The Memphis, Tennessee market has the volume and rejections. What surprises me is that Florida, the Jacksonville area, has volume and tender rejections. But where would I stay if we were still operating our dry vans? I would stay Fort Worth, Texas, Midwest, maybe Indiana, Michigan, and that's pretty much it. I wouldn't even bother going to the West Coast because the West Coast looks dangerous. So yeah, I know that this week is a little bit more wonky because of the Memorial Day weekend, but the verdict is pretty clear. Flatbeds should continue staying in the South in order to grab as many opportunities as possible. But I have been hearing that Midwest is also an interesting place to be. I don't have that experience personally. I don't like the Midwest, but it's up to you. Reefer should go to Southern California, Fort Worth, Texas, and stay also in the Midwestern areas. Dry vans should stay away from the West Coast at all costs and stay within the Texas, Midwestern areas, and maybe check out the South as well. As for my week last week, well, it was pretty much brutal. One of our flatbeds ran through Memorial Day weekend without any issues, but the other one had a truck breakdown, which is costing us another $11,000. Thankfully, we had a spare truck in our fleet to continue operations while we get this one fixed, but yeah, maintenance and repairs are brutal. So friends, if you want to survive this market, I'll give you a piece of advice. Mind your cash flow and your expenses. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new that is useful to your operations. And I'll see some of you this Sunday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. See you guys then.